Recently, I found a video that included, as part of its title, "Proof for Your Liberal Friend," next to a popular right-wing talking point. I could see from the thumbnail that Matt Walsh was attached to this somehow, so I immediately imagined some poor person being shown this video by a friend of theirs and being completely caught off guard by whatever ridiculous arguments Matt Walsh was probably making on the inside. So I thought it would be good to have some kind of response to what seems to be a very obnoxious video to be sent. I made the mistake of thinking this was an original series, but it turns out it's actually a collection of older Matt Walsh videos that have been stitched together under a specific theme, kind of like a greatest hits compilation of some of the worst takes you've ever heard. With that in mind, I decided to watch them and put together some quick responses to a man who has the intelligence of a bowl of cat piss. In the video titled, "The South African White Genocide is Not Fake News," Matt Walsh offers very little in the way of facts, and instead provides a review of Donald Trump's press conference with South African President Cyril Ramaphosa. It's not a very promising start for a video claiming to have proof of a genocide. When we finally get to the part of the video where some kind of evidence shows up, it's the moment in the press conference where Donald Trump started playing audio from a minority political party, and then he highlights some comments from golfer Retief Goosen. It's all very underwhelming stuff.
This is one of the golfers that the president of South Africa brought to the Oval Office as part of the South Africa's, delegation, hoping he'd neutralize the supposedly fake narrative, quote unquote, about white genocide.
The golfers weren't there to testify about farm murders. They were there to appeal to Trump as a big fan of golf. In fact, Trump was the one who requested they be there.
When I spoke to you, you said, yes, come along and bring Gary Player, bring Annie else, and Retief Goosen. I brought the two of them.
Matt Walsh doesn't seem to understand why this press conference was happening. The president of South Africa was there to reset relations and trying to find investment into his country after the US pulled aid a few weeks prior. It was Trump who brought up the farm murders in that press conference in what amounted to an obvious ambush, particularly when he started pulling out materials that supposedly supported his claim, like the aforementioned audio recording or printouts of news articles that detailed crimes.
Look, here's burial sites all over the place. These are all white farmers that are being buried.
So just, it's an incredible moment.
A website called Africa Check went to the great trouble of not only debunking many of the claims made, but also finding origins for the various articles Trump held up. The 8 articles highlight only 2 actual murders, and one of them happened back in 1999. One of the articles also mentions the Lauren Southern movie Farmlands, which came out several years ago, which similarly repeats the conspiracy theory of white farmers being murdered because of racial tensions. I debunked that in an older video if you'd like to see more details on why this narrative is absolute nonsense. Recent stats, according to South African Police Minister Senzo Mchunu, detail that between October 2024 and March 2025, there were 18 murders on farms in South Africa, and of those 18 people, only 2 of them were white. And these numbers are historically lower than from where they've been in the past. If we look back further in time, the number of murders that happen on farms usually amounted to less than 100 a year. The racial breakdown of the victims is a lot harder to find, but it's almost certain that these aren't just white farmers. There have certainly, of course, been far more farm attacks, where the numbers are in the several hundred, but we're getting further away from that mass killings narrative. There is, of course, a challenge when looking at these numbers. Not every crime is reported and not every crime is solved, but the stats we have so far are a far cry from any kind of white genocide that's supposedly happening. In the second half, we get this weird, almost wistful discussion of apartheid.
Since the end of apartheid, which was supposedly the greatest evil to ever befall mankind, a lot of bad things have been happening.
He goes on to list some of the problems facing South Africa, but what he's really upset about here is South Africa's policy of transferring farmland from white South African farmers to black South Africans.
No person of any race should be subjected to land seizures or violence as part of accountability for historic privilege, whatever the heck that means. But that's what the government of South Africa is now demanding by their own admission.
Matt Walsh is skirting around something in that clip he speaks to a bit later on.
Make no mistake, the reason those white people control the farmland in South Africa is because historically they're competent. They bought it, they maintained it for generations, nobody handed it to them or maintained it for them.
He's glossing over huge swaths of history where land was brought under control of the white minority and black South Africans were disenfranchised and segregated. It's a whitewashing of colonialism, but I think it might be because Matt Walsh believes in an alternate form of history.
And in many cases, they were there long before black South Africans arrived and demanded their property.
This is, of course, absolutely not true. What Matt Walsh just referenced is the empty land myth. It's an idea that goes back to the 19th century that the land in South Africa was uninhabited and should go to whoever could claim it by force. This is a misreading of African politics by British and Dutch settlers. Matt Walsh's rhetoric has a clear similarity to far-right commentary on South Africa that goes back many years. Walsh also brings up a comparison to Zimbabwe.
Zimbabwe already tried this. Several decades ago, they made the decision to seize farms from whites, give them to black citizens. When you use the government to redistribute fertile farmland to correct some alleged injustice, what you get is famine. Okay, that's what equity means in practice.
This is an atrocious reading of history. Although Zimbabwe is certainly in a rough state right now, Walsh is ignoring the reality of what happened there and acting like this was all done in the misguided attempt to fight injustice. The truth is that, while Zimbabwe had a similar system in the 1980s as what would be adopted in South Africa 20 years later, over time this system transformed in Zimbabwe and started confiscating farmland and giving it not to people who had been dispossessed of it, but rather to party insiders. An article from Al Jazeera explains, under the cover of correcting colonial injustices, powerful officials seized productive farms from both white and black farmers. Mugabe once campaigned for a one-man, one-farm policy, yet his allies ignored it. Even his wife, Grace Mugabe, amassed at least 15 farms. Walsh's references to generational understanding of how to farm and competence speak to this deeper assumption that black Africans simply can't farm, or at least aren't as good at it as white people. And that's how he's mapping what's happening in Zimbabwe onto what's happening in South Africa, noting the economic difficulty both countries are facing. Of course, the fact that South African private farms are still majority owned by white farmers is not really reconciled with this comparison. If the country is currently in a rough state economically and you want to blame black people, it doesn't really make sense when most of the farms are still owned by white people. But the narrative he's constructing doesn't rely on facts. It rests on racist assumptions built on half-truths. A better look at why farms in South Africa are struggling and the failures of the land transfer were explored in the 2022 book, The Inheritors, an intimate portrait of South Africa's racial reckoning by Eve Fairbanks. In one chapter, she goes into detail about the challenges the land transfers brought. There were arguments over what to do with the land and a struggle for some people to know how best to work it. Michael Buys, a land reform official appointed by the ANC in 2010, was interviewed. Here's an excerpt from the book that details some of the failings of the ANC and the limitations of the land transfer policy. Of course, many beneficiaries were underskilled. That was what the apartheid regime intended. I was also embarrassed for myself, he said, because I knew these people's grandiose fantasies were due to the promises we had been making. So part of what Walsh is saying is approaching the truth insofar that people who had no experience managing farms were given them without the experience they needed to really make them work. But the only reason I point this out is to make it explicitly clear that no one is saying that these programs didn't make mistakes. What's more important, though, is that he leaves out another crucial part of the story, one that explains that these failures aren't simply a product of people not having the skills to make these farms work. Here's another excerpt from the book. White-style farming in South Africa may have looked good, but only because it rested on the segregationist regime. Most smaller farms that succeeded under apartheid did so because workers without land protections were cheap and because economic sanctions insulated them from competition. When markets opened up after apartheid ended, farms that had been economically viable suddenly weren't. White farmers have been failing in huge numbers. Between 1994 and 2009, when Machubeng got his farm, 3 successive white owners had failed to make any profit off of it. Elliot Machubeng, the man mentioned at the end there, got his farm in 2009, and unsurprisingly, it failed, and he eventually had to sell it. To give you an idea of what it was like for one of these black South Africans to suddenly possess a farm, when Machubeng first set foot on the farm, he found out he was starting in the hole as he had to deal with a 5,000-pound electricity bill. His fields were completely covered in weeds, and several of the sheds around the farms had roofs that had caved in. It's not that they were given fully functioning farms and let them fall to crap. These farms, in many cases, were already in a rough state when they were transferred over. The state of these farms mirrored the state of the country after the end of apartheid. Here's another excerpt from the book. The apartheid government was almost bankrupt when it handed over the reins to black people. It was partly a relief for the last white leaders of South Africa to pass the buck. Instead of giving up a prize, you could say de Klerk managed to sell a used car on the verge of a breakdown to a family that only realized, when they got in to drive it, that it was a piece of crap. But the family had no other options, so it became necessary for them to convince themselves that they'd got something of value. Michael Buys, the land reform official, confessed to me what felt like to him a shameful secret. Under apartheid, we were always looking at the white areas. He said, it looked like they had everything. There was a sense among us that the country that had been bequeathed to us was the white country. But it wasn't. He dropped his voice. It was the whole country. Every messed up element that had existed under apartheid, in other words. At one point in his video, Matt Walsh bemoans the frequent blackouts that occur in South Africa, something I'm sure that annoys most of the people who live there. But what he doesn't mention is that, during apartheid, half of South Africans had no electricity at all. This is the challenge South Africa faced and continues to face as a nation. But the opining of Walsh for the days of apartheid is part of how he's attempting to rewrite history to justify the oppression of Black South Africans, and Black people more broadly. This is why the farm murder narrative is important too. It presents Black people as an inherent danger to white people, and that white people need to rule over them. The fact that he has to lie so much about it reveals how this has no basis in reality. Which is a nice segue into the next video. This one is titled, "The Hate Crime You Heard About Was Probably Fake." This is another video that shoots off a couple of anecdotes in an attempt to discredit the idea that hate crimes are happening at a notable rate. This is another favorite of conservative media because these stories don't amount to much more than amplifying local news to create a broad narrative, using these small anecdotes to undermine broader statistical trends. For example, Matt Walsh brings up one story of a small noose being found in Allentown.
This is a noose that back in January was reported to the police by a city employee in Allentown.
This was investigated and the police alleged that the person who discovered the noose likely placed it there themselves. This is a pattern for every anecdote shared in this video. A hate crime is alleged, and after an investigation, it's revealed to have either been staged or there was some complicating factor.
At no point do they present any context, like the vast number of fake hate crime hoaxes involving nooses in this country. That's important context, that these things are always fake, but they didn't tell you that.
I wondered if I could find an example of a hate crime involving a noose that actually led to a hate crime charge, and it turns out that's pretty easy. In Delaware, 2 former firefighters were accused of chasing around one of their colleagues while carrying a noose and calling them racial slurs. In this case, instead of the investigation finding it to be faked, the 2 guys who were charged claim it was a joke, but it seems very clear that the person who was the target did not find it funny. It's not that hard to find other examples of hate crimes involving nooses either, ones that not only lead to charges, but also convictions. To say they're all fake is just wrong. Walsh's clip is specifically about nooses, but this is a generalized tactic he uses towards all hate crimes. What Matt Walsh is trying to do in this video, and videos like these, is to train his audience to turn a blind eye to any hate crime that gets reported in the media. The problem is he's really just showing us anecdotes and there's no real analysis of the media on a quantitative level. You can find examples of a local news team screwing up all the time. It's not that hard. But how often does this happen? And more importantly, does this have any impact on hate crime statistics? The FBI reports that there were nearly 12,000 hate crimes in 2023. The number of nearly 12,000 hate crimes only includes crimes that law enforcement found to be credible. This is not a number Matt Walsh brings up, and he doesn't bring up any hate crime stats at all. What undermines his narrative is that this figure doesn't include any of these hoax stories he loves to bring up, because, without exception, all the anecdotes he mentioned were investigated by law enforcement and found not to be hate crimes. And that's even giving the police the benefit of the doubt that all these crimes are investigated fairly, and obviously it doesn't include any crimes that weren't reported to the police at all. The reason these fake crime anecdotes seem salient is because people respond to stories more so than data, and fake hate crimes get spread over right-wing media while real ones get ignored. Although it's interesting to notice that Matt Walsh tends to ignore hate crimes that don't fit into his narrative.
Of course, there are a bunch of anti-LGBTQ assassins roaming the streets of Southern California on the hunt for anyone who looks gay, so they can set them on fire.
In this case, he's talking about a gay man who is set on fire, which was first reported as a hate crime, but then later updated when it was revealed that he was set on fire after he assaulted a pregnant woman. Matt Walsh's mocking tone about people targeting random gay people made me wonder if I could find a hate crime where this actually happened. And I found this recent story of a man charged with attacking 2 same-sex couples outside a hotel in Detroit. It's not the same as being lit on fire or happening in California, but yeah, sometimes gay people are attacked in the middle of the street. The story won't get covered by Matt Walsh because it's not the kind of anecdote that supports his narrative. DEI is destroying the air travel industry was made in response to an air crash that ignited a firestorm about how diversity programs were supposedly compromising airline safety. You better believe the evidence for this amounts to a few anecdotes. The context for this first one is a little muddled. Basically, United Airlines announced a new initiative to launch a flight school, and half of the people enrolled were expected to be women or people of color. 2 years later, a conservative commentator asked United about an accident that had happened a few months prior, alleging that one of the people who graduated this program was somehow involved. These questions don't actually tell us anything about the crash, and they use such loaded language, it's clear that an agenda is at play here. A lawsuit that would happen sometime later revealed that a few of these assertions were accurate, like the co-pilot being a former flight attendant, though many of the other supposed facts presented have no evidence to support them, such as whether DEI played any role in the co-pilot being hired. This guy actually has a Portuguese last name, if that helps, though that could go either way on the diversity scale. Note that the questions also make no mention of the pilot, who happened to have a French last name and a very Anglo first name. None of the other claims that come up in these questions are referenced in the lawsuit or the accident report. The nearly totaled plane, by the way, looks like this. Also, none of the crew or passengers were injured, and the final determination did not place all the blame on the co-pilot, but rather it stated, and this is from the report, the co-pilot's improper control inputs after the airplane touched down and the flight crew's lack of recognition that the speed brakes were not armed were the causes of the hard landing and subsequent aircraft damage. None of these details were available to Walsh at the time, but he was more than happy to post speculation that this was just an incompetent DEI hire, which is ironic because in the previous video I was looking at where he was talking about hate crimes, he was raking the local news over the coals for reporting on stories without having all the facts.
If you don't look into any of the other details or inspect it in any way whatsoever, then maybe that's enough for you.
But in this case, he's ready to use someone's unanswered questions as evidence for his video. It shows us that this accident is really just a prop being used to advance an agenda, something he was accusing the local news media of, except the local news would often correct the record when new information became available, whereas Matt Walsh is simply reposting old videos that have incomplete information without updating anything. The other accident he highlights is even more egregious, as in this case, there was a lot more information available, because this was a crash that happened in 2019.
In its final report on the crash, the NTSB cited, quote, systemic deficiencies in the aviation industry's selection and performance measurement practices, which failed to address the first officer's aptitude-related deficiencies and maladaptive stress response. Now, what explains those systemic deficiencies? Well, we can't say for sure. We do know that Conrad Asca was born in the Caribbean nation of Antigua. He was a black man, which certainly checks some diversity boxes. And we also know that Atlas Air's website is full of platitudes about the importance of hiring candidates based on certain characteristics like their race and gender.
There was a great write-up I found that went over the NTSB report that explained how Conrad Asca got the job. The reason this unqualified man was hired was not because of DEI, it was because Asca lied about his past. He withheld the fact that he had a history of failing multiple training programs, and he made up these stories about being a real estate agent or attending university during those gaps in his employment history. He did not mention that he worked for other airlines, so his future employer, Atlas Air, didn't ask to see any of those records. There were FAA records of Asca, but it turns out they were incomplete and used vague language instead of explaining how he had failed his pilot exam 9 times. The reason why Asca seemed like a strong candidate was because his record only listed 1 or 2 failures, and he had a higher than usual experience flying the type of plane he would have been expected to pilot at Atlas Air. One interesting note on this is how those FAA records actually should have included that information in their database, but it had not been fully implemented. At no point in any of this does it say standards were lowered for Asca because he was black. Matt Walsh just made that up because he couldn't be bothered to learn the details about this story. That, by the way, is the only other piece of evidence that's mentioned in this entire video. 2 anecdotes, 4 years apart, where it was the co-pilot, who is assumed to be a diversity hire, is the only one held responsible for a plane crash. But what's probably most pathetic in the first part of this video is how he feels the need to mock a program designed to get more black women into aviation.
This is an organization that's training the pilots that are flying commercial aircraft. And this isn't training, really. It's like a kindergarten classroom. And with these vapid self-help slogans and inspirational slogans, at no point are these people concerned about safety or competence.
The video that's upset him isn't a training video for pilots. It's a promotional video to show young girls that they can have the opportunity to become pilots. Young girls, by the way, who might need encouragement instead of assuming that people like them just aren't meant to be pilots.
Why do you think more Black women aren't becoming pilots? It's extremely expensive. I mean, it takes upwards of $100,000 to get your licensing to fly. So if our young ladies are not seeing it, if their parents don't have the funding for it, then it's not going to happen.
Well, that's inspirational. If they can see it, they can be it. You know, that's the kind of thing. If you're flying a plane, you know, that's what you want out of your pilot.
You'll notice Walsh doesn't mention the systemic barriers that prevent Black women from becoming pilots that was mentioned in the video. He seems incapable of understanding this problem, and he really brings that home later in the video. Here he makes my argument for me, and to be fair, he does a decent job of summarizing it.
You know, they still have the same hiring standards in place that they always have. So if they hire somebody with a physical disability or a psychiatric problem, that person is still going to have to pass all the same tests and demonstrate his fitness in the same way as anybody else, which means that if they get the job, then they're qualified.
Where this falls apart is Matt Walsh has this almost childlike assumption that the world of hiring before DEI was purely done on the basis of merit.
If they were just letting anybody apply and then hiring the best of that crop, then you wouldn't need DEI because that was already the case.
Now, I'm going to say something that I guess will blow Matt Walsh's mind, but hiring practices are not based entirely on merit. One of the most robust findings in psychology is how discrimination happens in the hiring process. Multiple meta-analyses and countless experiments have been done to demonstrate this. None of this research is difficult to find, but Walsh is apparently unfamiliar with it. I've highlighted a few meta-analyses to show the level in which discrimination is still at play when it comes to hiring people. And we haven't begun to describe how nepotism, personal connections, and other non-merit-based factors influence the hiring process. And this is just looking at how people are hired. There are other examples of discrimination in the workplace that limit people's ability to achieve, from biases in management to a lack of accommodations for people with disabilities or less common cultural traditions. And there's still the broader social systemic barriers that create disparate outcomes in employment results. Remember when Matt Walsh conveniently ignored the point about how young Black girls often don't have the financial resources to become pilots? That's another reason we see this disparity, and one that will take a lot of work to fix. But listening to Walsh, he seems unaware of this, and instead rests on the assumption that since hiring is already fair, the only way to increase diversity is to lower standards.
Before DEI, whatever the standards were, you had however many people you had in whatever demographic, right? And if you want more of that demographic, the standards are going to get lowered. Because with the standards up here, you had, the standards were up here, you had X number of people in your favored demographic. So if you want to get even more, then that means the standards are going down here.
At no point does he point to a single standard that has been lowered, never mind one that has been lowered for the sake of DEI. If the airlines are lowering standards, he should be able to explain what those standards are and when they started lowering them. There's nothing to see here other than a man trying to use what passes for logic to work his way through a topic he knows nothing about. But he lets us know what might be guiding his thoughts in this part of the video.
Here's an industry that's doing fantastically well, has achieved feats unknown to mankind. What's the demographic predominantly responsible for that? Let's single them out and then try to get rid of them.
That's the undercurrent in all of this, that Matt Walsh seems to think that when pointing out a historic fact that white men have dominated aviation, that some admission is being made, that white men have some inherent quality that makes them more suited to the job. I wish he'd just come out and say what he's dancing around here, that he thinks white men are genetically better at aviation than others, that he believes history is a product of genetic superiority rather than historical forces. Because when he sees these attempts to address the inequalities created by this history, where high-paying pilot jobs have been monopolized by white men, he frames it as white men having something taken away from them. To think that white men are naturally the inheritors of these jobs clearly shows us that he thinks that race somehow determines one's ability to fly a plane, or at least should confer some kind of birthright. I need to make a quick apology to any children who are currently watching. I said Matt Walsh has a childlike understanding of something. Really, it'd be more accurate to say he has a willful ignorance fueled by racism. And that's not something children are born with. That's a kind of closed-mindedness you have to learn. The video, Woke Teachers Affirm False Identities, doesn't have a lot to debunk because it's literally just a few random tweets from libs of TikTok. For some context, he's reacting to a Facebook post in a private group for LGBT plus school professionals, and in that post, a person is describing how they feel more comfortable wearing gender non-conforming clothing at work. Although Matt Walsh helpfully shows us how ill-equipped he is to discuss anything related to gender.
NB. The hell is NB? Non-binary, NB. And then he identifies himself as a demi-boy again. And if you're wondering what a demi-boy is, I had to Google that.
After having to look up both online, he's confident enough to say this.
Because that's total nonsense, okay? Absolute nonsense. What it actually means for this creep is that he has a fetish for wearing women's underwear around kids, and this is the label that he puts on it to make it sound, like something we have to affirm and include and accept.
It's amazing how bad he is at understanding language. The phrase demi-boy means someone who doesn't identify fully within the masculine category of gender, but feels partially aligned with it. It's a term used to reflect someone's complex relationship with their gender. It doesn't mean nothing, like Walsh interprets it, but this is a technique he uses a lot. To brush it off as nonsense is to reveal how shallow a thinker he is on the subject. He can't even get to the more complicated question about how many non-binary people are wrestling with a language that has historically not made space for them, hence the challenge of figuring out what an acceptable term is and how it might be applied. It's not surprising there are all these different terms popping up because this is something that previously was not widely discussed in society. The part where he has to look up agender is probably the most revealing, though.
What the hell is agender? Okay, now you gotta look that up.
Anyone who's ever heard the term apolitical or asexual should have been able to figure this one out on their own. This is not a thoughtful man we're dealing with here. It's also possible that this was staged, and I'm often told that he's being ironic when he says something ridiculous. But if the joke is he's not smart enough to figure out what agender means, I think the only joke here is on himself. Here's another weird part of the video.
What percentage of those parents would be excited about the idea of a male teacher in his panties who wears them because he says it makes him feel good, and sitting down and coming out to his students and having a sexual conversation? Like, what percentage, if we were to poll every single public school parent, what percentage would say, oh yeah, that's great?
Turning these hypotheticals on their head really reveals how absurd they are. Do parents have the right to know what kind of underwear teachers are wearing? It's incredibly creepy and weird that this is something he thinks parents should know. This message was posted to a Facebook group for LGBT plus school professionals to discuss things in private. This person isn't announcing to the school what sort of underwear they're wearing, and I don't think they expected a Twitter account to post it to their millions of followers. But now Matt Walsh is bringing it up as if it's something that the entire public, or at least all the parents who have kids in this school, need to weigh in on and be made aware of. And the part about coming out as non-binary has nothing to do with having a fetish and everything to do with being addressed by the right pronouns, whether your students might call you sir or miss or something else entirely. The other bits of evidence Walsh brings up in this video is a teacher who is happy that her kids are using pronouns properly, which Walsh twists into the kids being victimized or groomed into something. And the other two are teachers who think many of the kids they teach are LGBT+. How accurate that may be, we don't really know, and we know even less what kind of an impact these teachers have on them. But this is enough material for Walsh to go on a screed about the dangers of these teachers based on a 30-second clip. This is how he proves his case. He finds these little anecdotes, invents elaborate stories around them, and he just asserts that there is some wider force at play here. Walsh imagines this great danger facing children, but he never actually showed us evidence of kids being harmed. He just assumes that if they meet an LGBT plus person, it will damage them. This moral panic has never been about keeping kids safe. It's about making LGBT plus people feel unsafe. In the video ADHD is overdiagnosed, I have to admit we get a few interesting points, such as when Walsh starts complaining about Big Pharma's marketing strategies.
In 2020, the year of the great pandemic, Pfizer spent $12 billion on marketing compared to just $9 billion on R&D. Companies like AbbVie and Johnson & Johnson and Bayer and many other pharma companies posted similar numbers.
It's starting to sound like a thoughtful critique on how businesses use their vast financial resources to market their medications. The efficacy or even need of some of these drugs, I think, is perfectly fine to question. How common some conditions may be compared to how common people might think they are because of marketing is an interesting idea to explore. The problem is that Matt Walsh just doesn't have the knowledge, experience, or, quite frankly, intelligence to handle this subject. He thinks conditions like ADHD are completely made up.
But this mother wants her 6-year-old to be less like a 6-year-old because it's very inconvenient to have a 6-year-old acting like a 6-year-old in the home. And that's why she desperately needs the drug. And by she, I mean the mother, not the child.
His hypothesis basically boils down to parents too lazy to raise their children or those who want to give their children a competitive edge in school, and they are forcing these ADHD diagnoses and medications on them. Also, this is because there are too many distractions and female teachers.
As women increasingly entered the workforce and replaced men in teaching jobs, we're not supposed to draw any conclusions about how the behavior of male children is now being addressed.
This proof video is accidentally pretty helpful. If you caught that random video of Matt Walsh complaining about pharmaceutical companies advertising aggressively, you might think he's a commentator with some interesting ideas. But when you see him in another video complain that female teachers don't know how to teach boys, and that's why everyone is getting diagnosed with ADHD, it becomes more obvious he's completely lost. And of course, the data he uses to support his claim is a correlation, and you can tell how insecure someone is about what they're about to say when they open their argument like this.
At the risk of angering all the people who will scream from the rooftops that correlation doesn't equal causation, like it's some kind of scriptural edict, here's some data that's worth considering.
Calling it scripture sarcastically isn't the knockout blow he seems to think it is. And I guess we need a quick refresher on why correlation is not causation, and why that is actually incredibly important. Causality is a major component of scientific inquiry. To know how one variable influences another, it's the very basis for experimental design. Correlation isn't as powerful as causation because it can't account for one or more variable that may be the causal one. There are countless goofy correlations one can point to that should demonstrate why causation is important to establish. And if you're just resting on a correlation, that's not very firm ground to be on. That doesn't mean it can't possibly be true. It just means a lot more work needs to be done to actually make your case. Matt Walsh, instead of doing that work, can only whine about how people talk about this like it's scripture. It's basic science. And he doesn't seem to understand any kind of science. A look at the actual data of where these growing numbers of ADHD prescriptions are coming from also completely undermines the point he's trying to make here. Because it isn't young boys who are being prescribed ADHD medication more often, but rather adults, and women in particular. At least that's according to recent data from the CDC. In fact, looking at prescriptions for males 19 years and younger shows they actually went slightly down from 2020 to 2021. While ADHD diagnoses have been going up, with 2022 seeing an increase, this does need to be weighed against the fact that when it comes to ADHD medications, adults are far more likely to be prescribed medication rather than children. 1 out of 20 kids with ADHD are prescribed medication to treat it, whereas for adults, it's 1 out of 3. Of course, this is just reading dry statistics. Matt Walsh is also bad at reading research.
There is nothing remotely interesting or surprising about this footage. It's exactly what you would expect a normal, healthy child to do. But in the academic world, which exists to sell pharmaceuticals to children, this was a groundbreaking experiment.
He seems to think that this paper was trying to prove that kids pay less attention to math than they do movies, probably because he quoted a headline from Science Daily and he didn't actually read the research paper itself. Although, to be perfectly honest, the Science Daily article isn't that difficult to follow either. But if we go directly to the paper's abstract, we can see this is about operationalizing casual observations, something you have to do in scientific research. So I don't think the researchers were surprised at the findings, but it does provide hard data that can be used for other types of research in the future. For example, everyone knows gravity exists, but to actually learn something about gravity, you need to measure how it works, which required scientists to actually step up and do. Matt Walsh's reaction is a lot like if you met someone who published a paper that said objects accelerate towards the Earth at 9.8 meters per second, and then saying to them, "Oh, nice work, but we already knew things fell when you drop them." It's not like this is a new discovery. It's trying to convert this casual observation into a scientific finding so it can be more easily applied to research. However, what's Even worse is that if you read this particular paper that Walsh is commenting on, what it was describing is the measurable differences are for fidgeting during different cognitive tasks for kids with ADHD, to measure specifically one symptom of ADHD in this specific context. Matt Walsh so doesn't understand this that he seems to think they were just looking at one kid or maybe just one group.
Now, unless you're an alien who's never interacted with a child and was never a child yourself, there is nothing remotely interesting or surprising about this footage. It's exactly what you would expect a normal, healthy child to do.
If he actually read the paper, he would see that they compared two different groups of children, one group that was diagnosed with ADHD and one group that wasn't. And they found that while their behavior watching the movie was similar, the kids with ADHD began fidgeting more frequently during the math video. So the experiment is showing us that kids with ADHD, when presented with more cognitively demanding tasks, are far more likely to fidget. There's something incredibly sad about watching this man fail to understand a single study, never mind ignoring decades of research into this condition. Concerns over the rising number of ADHD diagnoses are fine to have, but this guy isn't capable of engaging with the science and isn't worth listening to about it. Feminism is a twisted ideology is actually a surprisingly great example of modern conservative critiques of feminism. Both videos clipped in this feature the same rigorous study of feminism typical of conservative pundits, reacting to angry tweets online. This is all in response to a tweet he made about how a woman not taking a man's name at marriage is a deal breaker for him.
Bethany says, I really don't hold much importance to my surname, a random name my granddad chose in a pub after moving to England.
From there, he goes on a rant about the importance of symbolism and how sharing a name matters in a marriage because it shows unity. I don't entirely agree, but it's not the worst point if you're someone who values symbolism that much in your relationship. The problem is all his defenses here of sharing a last name could easily be applied to a man taking a woman's name or a couple choosing to create a new name together. And obviously, it's no help at all to same-sex couples or any pairing that doesn't include a man, though he probably would have way more problems with those marriages outside of the names they chose. I was mostly waiting for the important part, why a couple should use the man's name specifically. His rationale for that is not great.
Because it's a significant and enduring cultural tradition.
Matt Walsh's appeal to tradition is intellectually lazy. He's attempting to shift the burden of the argument to the person breaking with the tradition rather than justifying the tradition himself. And he has no real justification for why the man should be the head of the family aside from calling it a long-standing tradition. It's weird that he uses this quote while arguing too.
But G.K. Chesterton said that there are many fences in the world that are worth tearing down. But you damn well better understand why the fence was erected before you demolish it.
Yes, I agree you should understand a tradition before tearing it down, but I think it's also important to understand that tradition if you want to uphold it as well. And he doesn't get into the history of last names and marriage and why the names of men are used. Amy Erickson, a researcher at Cambridge University, explained in an article that the practice of women taking the names of their husbands was uniquely British for hundreds of years, starting in the 14th century. At the time, it was a way of giving husbands ownership of their wives' assets. The previous standard had been management of the assets, but not ownership. This made it more difficult for women to attain divorces as their assets were not their own and they were entirely dependent on their husbands. This meant that women in France or Germany could get a divorce and keep their assets, while English women would be trapped in a marriage or risk having nothing after getting divorced. Although England was unique in this practice, eventually it made its way to North America and then became fashionable in the rest of Europe by the year 1900. So women taking the last name of their husbands is actually a relatively recent advent, and even in the places where it was more common, which would basically just be England, the article would highlight some interesting examples where the trend was actually reversed, specifically when the inheritance of wealth was on the wife's side in a marriage. There were some men who actually changed their surname to match their wives, so they would be able to inherit certain properties and other assets. So even in the one part of the world where this was a tradition, there were still exceptions. So Matt Walsh not only doesn't understand that this tradition is only from a very specific context of England, and its more widespread use in Europe is relatively recent, he makes the mistake of thinking this tradition is both universal and long-standing, and he skips the part where he actually learns about it. Is the kind of arrogance one finds in a person with a special kind of ignorance. The second part of the video highlighted is interesting in a completely different way. Once again, he's highlighting a tweet he made because I guess this is how he fuels most of his videos. This time it was blaming feminism for more deaths than the atomic bomb. He justifies this by blaming feminists for abortion. His explanation for why abortion is murder is as lazy as his other talking points.
The word fetus, Martina, simply means offspring. You are pretending that there is some sort of innate definitional distinction between offspring and baby.
I really dislike word games like these. Instead of providing a scientific explanation, he's just looking at a Latin root and calling it a day. Obviously, his beliefs are informed by his Christian nationalist worldview, but he doesn't explain it enough in this video to make diving into that worthwhile. What was really interesting was when he started to go after TERFs.
The only mildly interesting feedback came from the so-called gender-critical feminists, the feminists who oppose trans ideology, who reacted to my statement as if it was some kind of deep betrayal against them. We're on the same side nominally on the trans issue, which means that I am apparently required to pretend that feminism is good.
It's a very funny and revealing moment that these various reactionary movements are perfectly happy to operate in parallel. But when it comes down to it, there's always a hierarchy, and Matt Walsh is absolutely not going to let women be on the same level as him. There's a lesson here for anyone who isn't a white man. Working alongside people like Matt Walsh will only get you so far. Sooner or later, he will sell you out and act like you were never on the same side at all. And he's kinda right, because if you listen to what he says, he was never going to treat anyone who isn't like him as an equal. Illegal Immigrants Are Destroying America is Matt Walsh at probably his most grotesque. It's also the most emotional we see him in these videos. There's something about immigrants, specifically those making asylum claims, that really upsets him. The first section has him getting worked up over a few seconds of footage from an interview in Calais. This is a man trying to get to the UK. Many of the migrants in Calais are fleeing from Sudan. For those unaware, Sudan has been in the midst of a civil war for over 2 years. Although we spend a lot of time talking about Ukraine and Gaza, rightfully so, the crisis in Sudan doesn't get brought up nearly enough in the media. Right now, more than 150,000 people have died, and several experts have described a genocide occurring there. I'm not nearly educated enough to discuss the topic, but it's something I encourage people to look into. I've linked a few sources below if you'd like to read up more on it. I want people to keep this knowledge in mind when we listen to this man and how Matt Walsh responds to him.
English people pay for you to have a house.
Maybe they give me house, they give me anything I can need, they give me.
Just give it.
Yeah.
Why?
Because people in England is perfect.
Oh, so you think we're all rich people?
This is a guy coming from Africa, living in a tent, can't speak English. The only words he knows are "give me."
The anger Matt Walsh has here says so much about where he's coming from. Aside from hiding the fact that this man is fleeing a deadly civil war, he presents him as some entitled child who can only say, "give me." He even makes up a whole story about why he says that.
Before they go to an English-speaking country, and they're talking amongst themselves, and they're saying, "Okay, what are the main phrases I need when I go to this place?" And they've decided the only phrase they need is "give me."
If we look at the interview in a broader context, we can see why this man might have been saying, "give me."
Do you think that they give you money in England?
Yes.
Right.
Yes, but I think they are give me England. They are give me money. You can help me anything I can need. Okay. Maybe you help me.
So can I ask, why should the people of Great Britain give you a house and money?
So perhaps the reason this man, who clearly doesn't speak English as his first language, is using the phrase "give me" is because the interviewer asks him if he thinks he'll be given any money in England. But Matt Walsh doesn't share that part, or anything that might allow someone to feel sympathy for this man. The interviewer here, by the way, is a guy called Patrick Christys, who works for GB News. I know very little about this outfit or this guy, but he presents this as going to the front line of the crisis and walks around like he's reporting from a war zone, when really he's just in northern France. Here's how he opens the video with him coming under fire.
Yesterday, I visited the front line of the invasion of Britain, the illegal migrant crisis in northern France. Talk to people here. Oh, so we've just had an object thrown at us. Let's just have a little look at that. So that's an object that's just been thrown at us from somewhere over there.
This is the danger he faced on the front line. This whole segment is clearly an anti-refugee hit piece by someone who wants people to be afraid of them. It's not surprising that this is where Matt Walsh gets his information. Going back to the Walsh video, he offers a challenge in it.
I would love for anyone on the left to try to explain why we would want that guy in our country.
Obviously, no one knows that man's specific story, but he's talking about refugees more broadly, what a country gets from accepting them. I could and will eventually humor him, but I want to point out first that he's not actually looking for an answer.
But you can't answer that question because the answer is nothing. We do not benefit at all in the slightest bit from having a guy like that in the country.
This is how his rhetoric works. Pretend to want to have a debate and then pretend the other side has no response. I'm assuming the people watching this video aren't Matt Walsh, which is a huge credit to all of you. And you might actually be curious as how someone like me on the left would justify the need to help refugees. Personally, I would just stand on the humanitarian grounds. I don't need to be personally enriched, and I don't need my country to be enriched in order to help people. I think it's actually good to help those around you if they're in need. You can't help the whole world, of course, but if someone goes to the trouble of reaching your country to ask for help, I think offering that help is a good and moral thing to do. If you'd like a more practical argument, refugees contribute greatly to the economies of countries they enter. There is, of course, an upfront cost of helping them get settled, but the long-term impact is very clearly a positive one. A study recently published looked at the impact of refugees on the United States over a 15-year period. The end result found that refugees cost the government $457.2 billion, working out to roughly $3 billion a year, which amounts to less than 0.1% of the annual budget. In return, refugees paid $581 billion in taxes over the same period, meaning that refugees were a net gain for the U.S. government of $123.8 billion. That margin does shrink when you factor in spouses and children, but it still works out to a net gain of $16 billion in taxes. The next part of the video hits a different part of the narrative that Matt Walsh wants to push, that refugees are actually living better than Americans. In this case, he's reacting to a group of migrants in Denver who are demanding better accommodations than the city is providing. They had been in state-provided shelter, but decided to live in tents because of how bad the conditions were in that shelter. They sent the city a list of demands, and one of those demands was for fresh food so they can cook their own meals.
And these illegal immigrants are saying, I don't just want what everyone else has who's a legal citizen. I want more than they have. I want to live better than they do.
He's framing this as if these people are demanding a trip to Whole Foods for the finest products. But he later plays a clip from a local news report that explains what that request for fresh food really means.
There have been so many complaints about the food being spoiled or not being enough and malnutrition amongst children. As these facts and the clear footage of the horrible conditions these people live in are being shown, he cuts off the clip. Or immigration.
I can't even listen. It makes me sick. It makes me sick.
Matt Walsh did something similar a few moments earlier when he was reading their list of demands. He just trails off.
All shelters will receive connection to employment support. And then they want lawyers and a bunch of other things too. Okay.
Yes, these people want jobs. Funny how he doesn't want to talk about that because it makes them seem less like mooches, I guess. Other requests included legal support, no more abuse from the staff. They're asking that families not be separated, and for transportation so their kids can go to school. These are not exceptional claims to live a lavish lifestyle. These are basic things people need. Matt Walsh has to hide all of this so he can say this.
Many of, certainly the people that we just saw and that have created these demands, these are self-entitled egomaniacs.
Is it being a self-entitled egomaniac to ask to not be separated from your family, or for perhaps a bus to be provided so kids can go to school? You notice the pattern in all of these commentaries is that Matt Walsh needs to hide information about these people to make his audience hate them. I do appreciate the honesty at the very end when he pretends as if there's some element of him that has empathy and then reveals that actually no, he doesn't. He says he would like to see these people be nicer to him and express some gratitude, but even that request is meaningless because there is no appeasing this man.
Even if one of these people did say that, I would still deport them.
He doesn't care about who these people are or where they come from or what struggles they might have endured. He would sooner lie about them and campaign for them to be kicked out. Climate change is a lie is a funnier kind of disinformation piece because when talking about climate change, it's extremely difficult to obfuscate what is an incredibly clear and obvious scientific finding. The context for this is Walsh is upset that Hillary Clinton tweeted out something about climate change being caused by MAGA Republicans.
One day, out of nowhere, Hillary Clinton announces that MAGA Republicans are causing the world to get hotter simply by voting the wrong way and by cooking too many cheeseburgers, I guess. She says these MAGA Republicans are lighting the planet on fire.
And now all these media organizations are rushing to cover for her by pretending climate change exists.
You have to run cover for Hillary Clinton because she's effectively your boss. You revere her. Therefore, you have to go out on television and dutifully assert with maximum confidence that, yes, Hillary is right. We are breaking temperature records right now, and that's happening specifically because of man-made climate change that's intensified in recent years. Here's ABC News, for example, giving Hillary some much-needed backup.
Most of the ABC segment is going over the science of climate change and how it's very clearly and obviously driving the increases in temperature we've been seeing for the last several decades. But towards the end, it makes the point that voters make decisions based on climate change policy. Something so non-controversial, since they're reading a poll that just says that, you'd have to really work hard to invent a fantasy to find something nefarious here.
Notice they have the political analyst literally sitting right next to the climate expert just to underscore the point that this whole segment is about scaring as many Democrats as possible so that they vote in the next election.
Yeah, like that. As if running this news story in July of 2023 was all a plot to increase turnout in the 2024 election over a year away. A minute later, we get this.
So the expert is acknowledging that there have been periods throughout world history when the climate has gotten much warmer, obviously, but she says that was due to highly unusual events like volcanic interruption. And we don't have that right now, the expert says, at least not to any significant degree. So she concludes that Trump voters must be the problem.
The expert didn't mention Trump voters once. This is how badly Matt Walsh needs to lie about this segment. But the fun part actually comes a little bit later when he tries to use a scientific explanation for why July of 2023 was the hottest July on record.
An underwater volcano erupted in Tonga. It was so big you could see it from space. The entire west coast of the U.S. was put under a tsunami warning.
Yeah, he's blaming the increase in temperature on a volcanic eruption in 2022. No doubt, a massive volcano eruption like Tonga is going to impact the climate, but in no way does it contradict the fact that climate change has been happening for decades now. The graphs in the ABC report make it very clear that the Earth has been heating up for decades. This isn't something that began in 2022. To talk about a volcano being responsible is to miss the entire conversation on climate change that's been going on for so long, and to pretend this all started in the last few years. It's as though he's looking at a graph and saying, "Didn't you know a volcano exploded right here?" And what's even more damning is that more recent research shows us that the Tonga volcano actually might have cooled the planet instead of warming it. This is according to different research papers from Texas A&M and UCLA, citing that far less sulfur dioxide and much more water vapor was put into the stratosphere than initially expected. I know this is cheating a little bit because the research came out after this video was originally made, but if his channel is going to re-upload something that's been debunked, I think he should let people know that. But it's not about providing people with up-to-date information. It's about recycling old talking points. And that's at the heart of so much conservative commentary, just taking things that have been said in the past and repeating them in the present, completely ignoring any information that might complicate these arguments. Of course, when they were made in the first place, they didn't have good evidence for them either, so I guess it's holding them to the same standard. Towards the end of the video, Matt Walsh tries to brush aside climate change by saying this.
It may seem like you have to be crazy to believe in all the apocalyptic predictions that we hear constantly about climate change. It may seem like only a nutcase would believe this stuff, but that's not true.
The year 2024 was the warmest year on record, a record previously set in 2023 when that was the warmest year on record. And the next 9 record holders were all in the preceding 9 years. This is not alarmism. It's simply a fact that the planet is warming up at a very rapid rate, and that heat is having an impact on the weather. Someone like Walsh is not going to be convinced because he's either not smart enough or not willing to come to terms with the obvious reality we face. But I'm not a scientist, so I'd sooner play a clip of David Suzuki, a Canadian academic who I think spoke very clearly on the subject in a recent interview.
In 1992, over half of all Nobel Prize winners alive at that time signed a document, World Scientists Warning to Humanity. And it started, human beings and the natural world are on a collision course. And they defined what had to be done. And we didn't do anything about that World Scientists Warning, so that 25 years later, 15,000 scientists signed it from 184 countries in the world, Signed World Scientists Warning 2, that everything had got worse.
The solution to climate change increasingly looks like not just appealing to our existing systems, but overhauling them entirely to start operating in service of the interest of people rather than trying to drive the economy. Climate change is impacting all of us right now, and anyone not acknowledging that will never get there, or certainly won't get there in time to actually be part of the solution. The why matters less than figuring out how to enact change without these people. Since I started working on this video, several more of these proof videos have come out, but while I can't cover everything on here, I hope these quick responses can serve as a decent basis for understanding the dull, lazy mind of Matt Walsh. And you can probably imagine he's talking absolute nonsense when he's trying to explain how Lil Nas X is demonic and evil. I realize that responding to these videos, in some ways, I'm humoring this theater of debate that Matt Walsh is presenting in the branding of these videos, as if you just send one of these videos to your friends, it'll really give them something to think about. Really, it seems more like recycling old material to reaffirm people who already believe this stuff is true. I think that's one of the great tragedies of the Matt Walsh videos, though. They discuss so many important and interesting topics, but instead of actually doing real research and digging into them, he just reads out tweets and responds to TikTok videos. I'm not saying you can't look at that stuff at all, but it seems to be 95% of his research. I'd like to think we can do a little better. This video came together on a bit of a whim. I wasn't really expecting to discuss Matt Walsh again for a long time, but there was something about this proof for your liberal friend branding that just kind of bugged me, I guess. So I decided to dive into these videos, and you've got the result here. And I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you had fun, maybe learned something. And if you enjoyed it a lot, maybe consider supporting this channel by becoming a member or patron like the fine folks whose names you see scrolling up here. You'll also get my thank you, of course, which is priceless. And there are lots of fun bonuses that I throw in every now and again that make being a patron or member a little extra special. If you'd like to support this channel in a non-monetary fashion, you can like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell for notifications, or share this video on social media. Thank you all so much for watching.